Good morning everybody. Son Excellence le Dr Ousmane Sylla, l'ambassadeur de la Guinée, mais aussi
His Excellency Ambassador Sylla, and also the head of the Private Sector and Investment Subcommittee, and also the ASG. Good morning to all the distinguished ambassadors and representatives here. It's true, we're here in Belgium, and of course you wake up in the morning and it's raining, and that seems normal.
Bad weather to come here. Again, thank you very much for taking the time to come out and receive us. And I think, as the Assistant Secretary General has said, we signed an agreement. It's been exactly 2 years that I am at the head of the ECA. And a few months into that period, we signed an agreement with the ACP to see how we could work together. One of the things that we then started talking about, of course, there were already a few things we were doing together, but I think we tried to see how we can build a stronger relationship with the ACP partnership and to move forward. Just to give you a sense, because when we talk about the ECA, it's always a little bit blurry in people's minds. So one of the things that we set out to do was sort of put a little bit in a piece of paper, and I don't know if you have an English copy, I can't see Marlon. What is it that the ECA does? And so I think in front of you, you will have a brochure. If you just open it to the second page, you will be able to see. So we decided to say, if you ask yourselves, what do we do and how can we work together? We put out what we call five strategic directions for the vision of what we would like to do. The first one is to build analytical capacity for the continent. Essentially, as you know, a lot of what we need to do, a lot of what our leaders need to do to take the continent forward is to be able to first understand, what is it that we need to do and how can you analyze that, how can you build the kind of technical capacity that is needed to do the analysis that we need. So there is a lot of work that's going on, both internally in the ECA, to change the structure of the staff, to be able to have the kind of staff that is needed to do the analysis that the world needs and Africa needs as we go into the future. The second one, and I think for today, one of the most important ones, is to rebuild our macroeconomic analytical capacity and our structural capacity. The continent is growing at 3.4%. We need to grow at 10 if we really need to emerge. And as you know, there is 16 million youth that are looking for jobs every year that come out of get into the job market. To do that, we need to fix our macroeconomics. We need to find the kinds of structural decisions that need to be taken to make sure that we go forward in that. We are working on the macroeconomic side, so we have built a macroeconomic model in partnership with the IMF, essentially because the big tension on the continent today is growth and stability or austerity. The IMF's job is to make sure that Africans can pay their bills, that there is austerity. The UN's job is to make sure that we meet Agenda 2030, Agenda 2063. To do Agenda 2030, Agenda 2063, we have to worry about growth. And I think the challenge has always been, how can you do the kind of austerity that is needed to pay your bills and to meet the IMF's fiscal imperatives, but at the same time grow. And at the ECA, we have a narrative that says you can actually do both. But to do both, you need to take different kinds of macroeconomic policies. You need to address the challenges of growth and development differently. So we are building a model that helps us to have these two elements as opposed to just one of the two in that model. But also there are different things and other issues that are coming on. Climate change, the whole issue of demographics, and how we deal with the demographics. Sometimes it's a dividend, sometimes it's not. So we have this model that has both the macro, climate change, demographics, poverty. As you know, Africa now, in the next 10 years, Africa will be the continent with the highest number of poor people. We have about 12 countries on the continent, because the growth rates are slower than the rate of population growth, are actually creating more poor people than we are dividing. And then we have the debt issue. We have 16 countries on the continent that are in debt distress. And I think that since I'm talking to the African and the Caribbean, I think debt is one of those things that transcends the African continent and our Caribbean brothers are also a little bit in a bind on that question, is to see what are the things that we can do differently around the debt issue, and do we need to wait until you fall into debt distress, or can we do something before you get into debt distress to do some work? We're working with South Africa, we're working with Egypt, we're working with Ethiopia, of course, on our macroeconomic model. We just, I think concretely, I give you an example, because we had the macro model, we were able to go, and I see that there is a representative from Djibouti. The IMF went to Djibouti, did a macro model, came back from Djibouti saying Djibouti can no longer borrow, Djibouti must get out of the markets. We went in and said, if you look at it differently, maybe you can do this differently. We redid a different model, sent it to the IMF, and the IMF took our model. Djibouti can still now go to the markets, but they need to do a little bit more reform, and we promise we will do the reform with Djibouti. So this is what we are trying to do at the ECA, just to give you a sense of. The third piece of work that we're doing is innovative financing models. And that is a little bit why we're here today. For 60 years of its existence, the ECA did not have a private sector department. When I came to the ECA, I created one. I decided that we did need a full division that will be addressing issues of the private sector and looking at how Africa's private sector can come into its full life. Because we know that countries do not grow with the public sector. We know that you don't create jobs with the public sector. You need a vibrant private sector to do that. So we're doing a lot of work around sort of developing the private sector, stabilizing the private sector. Part of that, of course, is that the public sector needs to create its own wealth, and they need to collect taxes. In many of our countries today, the average tax rate on the continent is 16%. When Asia was growing at 10%, tax rates were 34%. So we are at 16, Asia was at 34. So this will give you a sense of the road that we have to travel if we need to grow as fast as we need to grow. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done. Be that as it may, on the private sector side and in innovative financing, one of the examples, and I see the representative from Kenya here, we are working with the government of Kenya to look at domestic pension funds. And essentially, we've put together a consortium of domestic pension funds, which is about $10 billion. And with those resources, we are now able to crowd in. We took U.S. pension funds to Kenya 5 months ago, and they were able to look at the potential investments in Kenya. And now 2 of those pension funds are actually going to invest in Kenya, blending with local pension funds. A year and a half ago, we did the same thing in Senegal, and also there was some investment in Senegal. And we're hoping that we will do that in a few other countries and see how we can raise the bar on investments and new financing. We're also doing some work on health, and we can come back to that. The fourth part of our program is on integration. Of course, integration is the big conversation on the continent. CFTA, trade, how we can break the borders. The beauty of the continent is that it's large. The beauty of the continent is that it's diverse. Some of the constraints of the continent are that because we're large and diverse, we still have some small countries and they don't have market size and scale. And integration then allows you to deliver some of that size and scale that will allow us to grow fast. We've been working very hard on the CFTA, and we thank all of you for your support. We still have a few countries that have not signed, and we hope that there will be countries that will sign and ratify, so that we have the continent. As we speak today, we have 29 countries that have ratified the CFTA. The CFTA, of course, is in force. A lot of the technical work around the CFTA happens at the ECA. We have a trade policy center that does a lot of that work. But we're also looking at integration of our airlines. We're looking at integration of our rail. We're looking at integration of our roads. We're looking, of course, at free movement of people and how that will work, and to make sure that, so when we talk integration, we are now, as the ECA, we have signed an agreement with Dubai ports, the Netherlands ports, and a couple of other ports to see how we can help and we're working with Togo as one of the core countries and Ghana as the second one, to see how we can improve ports logistics and essentially smooth the transition and the transfer of work across the continent. Because for the CFTA to actually work, you need to take goods from one place to the other and make sure that they work well. We have been asked by the heads of states to design the digital framework for the continent. For that, we have an agreement with Alibaba, which is the largest digital trading platform. We just had a meeting actually with the CEO of Ant Financials in New York last week to see how we can ensure that a woman who is trading or selling something in Zimbabwe can sell it to Algeria without needing to move. And I'm now getting into the women's conversation because that's what we want to talk about a lot more. But the CFTA will really benefit the most the women who cannot have access to a lot of these things, who don't have access to travel freely, and there's still a lot of constraints to women on the continent. But if we do the CFTA well, and you marry that with a digital space that is harmonized and interoperable, then we will actually be delivering, I think, a lot more for the women. When we talk about integration, because we are talking about ACP, of course there is a whole conversation around the diaspora and the African diaspora, which then necessarily brings together our brothers and sisters from the other side of the oceans in the Caribbean that we hope will also come back and invest with us. And I think that the government of Ghana is beginning to show that when you bring back the diaspora, you can actually bring back a lot of resources and a lot of revenue into the continent, and this is part of that conversation we have. And finally, one of the things that we want to do, or we try to do at the ECA, is advocacy. There is a lot that is happening on illicit financial flows, for example, where we cannot, even if the continent decided to do its best on illicit financial flows, we will never make a dent, because we do need the Brits and the French and the third jurisdictions to work with us to ensure that even if the money was taken out of the continent, it doesn't land in those other countries. So we do a lot of work around advocacy. We do a lot of work on migration and advocacy on migration. We're sitting in Europe where the conversation on migration is a big one. And there seems to be a tendency to say that, all the migrants are coming to Europe. But we've just done analysis recently that shows that migration stays on the continent. For some reason, maybe because of the food, the West Africans don't leave West Africa. 82% of the West Africans that migrate stay in West Africa. It's between Nigeria and Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, and they keep sampling each other's rice, but they don't get out of that space. 16% of Cote d'Ivoire's GDP is contributed by African migrants who've moved to Cote d'Ivoire. So the migration conversation is, first of all, an African conversation before it becomes an external conversation. Actually, migration out of the continent is dropping. It used to be 3%, it's now 2.7% and going to 2.6. So when you look at the overall numbers, it is actually, there is a huge drop. A lot of the migration from the continent into Europe comes from North Africa. The largest space of migration from from Africa into Europe is from North Africa. A lot of the migrants from Southern Africa tend to go to the United States and are usually going into universities and are mostly professionals. So again, some of the stuff that we try to do at the EC is unpack some of these numbers so that when we have it talked about in sort of the development space, we are talking about it in a way that makes sense and is informed. So those are the 5 big strategic directions that we have at the ECA. And you can sort of go through and look at the different divisions that we have created. A big part of what we do, of course, is data. We are a UN agency. We need to meet the Agenda 2030 goals. You will see at the last page, and I'll just skip a little bit the middle, at the last page we have what is essentially a mapping of Agenda 2063 and Agenda 2030, and it gives you a sense of everything that we do as the UN is also what the African Union is doing. And so we've tried to map these two things, and so that when we talk about 2063, we are also talking about 2030 and doing it in a way that is seamless and efficient. We do have agencies across the continent in Rabat, Dakar, Niamey, Yaoundé, Kigali, Lusaka, and Addis Ababa. And for each one of them, and I'm now looking at the page with the map of Africa, we have tried to study, do analytical work that responds to the issues of the sub-region. So, for example, in North Africa, we're doing a lot of work on labor markets, on jobs and employment, because that is the big issue in North Africa, as we all know, is a question of jobs. In West Africa, the big issue is the Sahel Demographics. How can we ensure that, the whole sort of Sahel belt is where Africa's population is rising the fastest. Climate change is causing a big problem. So that combination, high growth rates, but difficult climate change areas. Of course, in Southern Africa, we are looking at the questions of industrialization and inclusiveness, because 7 of the most unequal countries in the world come from Africa. Of the 7 in the world that come from Africa, 6 of them come from the Southern African region. South Africa is, of course, the most unequal country, the country with the highest inequality rate. So we are looking at how do you work on issues of inequality in Southern Africa. So that's what we do overall. And I'm happy to take questions on sort of that broadly. Now, it doesn't matter what you say, it doesn't matter how you talk. The question of gender is always at the center of everything we do. We know 50% of our continent, 50% of the globe is women. Unfortunately, we are not necessarily always represented in those numbers when the powers that be or decisions are made about our livelihoods. So I think that some people that have heard me, I said if we were to pick only one goal of the SDGs, we should just pick the gender goal. And if we were able to sort of get to a place of gender equality, we would probably meet the other 17 SDGs. So we have, and of course, when you have these positions and you're a woman, I think that as Madeleine Albright said, if you don't then make the gender question the question of your mandate, then there is something wrong. So we've decided to take a look at what can we do around women and women empowerment on the continent. But of course, when you empower a woman, you don't empower her in a geography, you empower her in the general development debate. We come from Africa, so we will do it in our geography, but we hope that whatever we do becomes a public good as we move forward. The 2 questions that I think we just talked about when we came from New York were climate change. Climate change, as we know, affects women the most. I think our friends and brothers from the Caribbean will tell the story better than us, because each time there is a cyclone or there is a huge weather event, it is the women that suffer, it's the kids that do not go to school, the health conditions are the most acute for the women. And so what we decided to do, the leaders of Africa and African women, Gracia Machel and Amina Mohammed and a few others, Binta Diop, came together before I joined the ECA and started something called the African Women's Leadership Network. And the network is a network of women who are doing politics and women who are working in social affairs and women who are working in education. And when I joined the ECA, of course I was coming from the private sector, I was asked to do something on finance. And initially they said do something on women in finance, SME financing, and I said no, I didn't want to do that. And after some thinking, we came up with the African Women's Leadership Fund. What is the African Women's Leadership Fund? We did some work that showed that on the continent, there are less than 10 women who head fund management agencies. So this is a continent of 1.2 billion people, and there's less than 10 women, essentially, that head and lead and own a fund management company. And this is important because, of course, when we go ask for resources, we're always asking for resources from the men. So essentially what ends up happening is the men decide, and the men have decided, particularly on the African continent, that women are only good for smallholder agriculture, SME agriculture. So today, if you're trying to look for resources on the continent and you're not doing agribusiness, and you're a woman, you almost immediately are in the wrong space. But if you tell the guy, I'm looking for money for agribusiness, they say, yes, we will give you. So they have decided, the guys, that women can only do agribusiness and we can do nothing else. And this is because the guys are on the other side of the table. And even though they're all good and well-intentioned, there is this tendency to direct the woman to what she needs to do because that's what we believe she should do. That's the first thing. The second thing is we found out in the part of the work that we were doing, and I used to be in the IFC, that the IFC, the CDC, the British DFID, the French IFD, probably you guys at ACP, all of us, when we give resources, we do not give resources to African-run businesswomen. 10% of the money that we give is to African-run business women. 20% is to women who do business in Africa. But 10% is to African-run business women. So even when we try, we find a man to give, we give the money to a man to give the women. We don't trust the woman enough to give her the money directly. And I think this is an unconscious bias. I don't think that, all these development agencies sat together and decided that that's what they will do. They just found themselves all doing it. Because it seems, and so we thought, what is it that we can do to change that? And the first thing that one can do to change it is probably to put women on the other side of the table. Let women be the ones who give the money. And if you do that, then the women will start saying, I want to give money to women. And even if they went from 10 to 20%, it would already be a 100% improvement. But we're hoping that we will go to 50% as they do that. So we decided we will create an African Women's Leadership Fund. The fund is not to give money to women businesses. The fund is actually to create women fund managers. And those women fund managers will in turn give 50% of the resources that they have to women businesses. So it's a chain that we're hoping to develop. The truth is that if you're a woman fund manager, it takes you about 3 years. It takes anybody about 3 years to raise a fund. If you're a woman and you have a family and you have kids that you need to send to school, you cannot do 3 years where you're unemployed, essentially. And that is the challenge of setting up a fund, is that you need the time to raise the resources. And it's very difficult to raise those resources. And when you're a woman, it's even more difficult. So essentially, and actually even the African men don't do very well in the space either. So the women do worse off, but the men are not as great in the space either. Most of the male funds are actually run by non-African men who have hired Africans to sort of work as their subsidiaries. So it's a difficult space. So what we thought was we will raise those resources, identify 10 to 15 African women, and then support them to grow the business. So we will do all of the back office services for them. We will ensure that they have the kind of skills that are needed to sort of go up in the business. So we decided that that's what we will do. We will go out in the market. We have already run the competition for identifying who some of the potential fund managers will be. Mostly they're women. We had 225 women apply. We did it as an online competition, so everybody could go in and apply. We've done 2 rounds now. We'll do a 3rd round just before we close the fund with your generosity. We're here to ask for resources. We need a $50 million fund. We have about $30 million in the fund, so we're hoping, we already have 30 million, so we're still looking for 20, and we're hoping that ACP will help close that gap for us as we try to launch by the end of the year. But the whole idea is that we will then have 2 women in each sort of areas of the subcontinent, essentially working to support. The other issue that we found is that, and this is actually true for women, I was very interested, across the globe, most women can grow a business up until, in Africa it's about $1.2 to $2 million. But in Asia, it's about $3 to $4 million. But there is a cap after which, as a woman business, you can't get more resources. Very difficult. So you grow your business and you get to the $2 million. And then after that, you cannot grow the business anymore. So we have just passed the CFTA. You want to take your business to 6, 7 countries. You can't, because the banks will not give you additional funding. But if you sell the business to a man, the next day he goes out and he gets funding. So there is also there is a psychology there where after 5 million, or on the continent after 1.2 to 2 million, you can't grow. That's why the men only give us SME money, right? If it's a woman who's looking for SME money, you get it very quickly. But the minute you're looking for real money to become a solid business person, you can't. So what we're hoping is that through this fund, the women will also be able to find those women who have already grown their business enough and are now looking for, your food. For example, there's a young lady in Zambia who is doing food and is now trying to diversify into the whole SADC region, but she cannot find the resources to go out. There is a young lady in Nigeria who is managing 3 private hospitals and doing a fantastic job. She wants to manage 6, but she doesn't have the resources to get to 6. Those kinds of ladies who have already been in the business for 5 years, so we know they know the business, we know they have demonstrated their capacity to lead and to manage, but cannot get to that next level. We're hoping that when we develop this fund, those will be the first tranche of women that the fund managers will pick up and begin to build a portfolio on. So as you see, we're trying to build a chain that starts with a woman who allocates the resources to another woman who hopefully then can hire a few more women, and the chain continues. So this is really the conversation that we want to have around women fund managers and how we do it. Next slide. I don't know if you have the presentations, I think, in front of you. I'm not going to go through all of it because I would prefer to open it up for questions. As I said, we're going to have if we have the 50 million, the reason we're looking for 50 million is because we have 5 sub-regions, of course, in the continent, and we're hoping to have 2, the slide that you have, and I think the numbers, I like to have, just stay on that slide for a minute. It's on your page 2. If you look at the numbers, 11% of senior investment professionals in almost all, so I'm looking at the second slide, the global African gender gap opportunity. It's really just to give you a sense of how far below we are on the issue. So it's 11% of senior investment professionals in emerging markets, private equity and venture capital are women. 11%. It's 1 in 10. I mean, the number is so low that you know that we need to do something different. Less than 10% of general partners are women. So even when you're not the manager, if you just to be a partner of a private equity firm for a woman, and most of this, and this is again the other issue, if we took out South Africa, it would be 2%. So again, most of this 10% comes from South Africa. So the minute you take out South Africa, you will randomly find 1 in Morocco and maybe 1 in Kenya, but then there is nothing else. So again, it's a very, very painful and dismal picture when you really look at it. 70% of all senior management teams are male. When we say 70%, we mean there is no woman at all in the senior management team of the private equity or the fund management. So, of course, when a woman comes with an idea and she's sitting in front of 10 men, if you're not talking smallholder agriculture, they don't know the difference. So they just say, okay, and again, the reason why everybody does smallholder agriculture is because, we've done 2 or 3 that have succeeded. And so the men don't want to rack their brains thinking, how can I really help a woman who wants to be a space engineer, or she's come up with some new idea that is technology sophisticated. 5% of women in Africa are CEOs, 5%. Again, South Africa. If you take out the South African numbers, you come out with 0.7%. So we have made progress on the continent, but we are still very, very far behind. The World Economic Forum did a report that said on women's empowerment, at the rate at which Africa is going, it will take us 150 years to get to parity. So we are still very, very far behind. And so those of us that are sitting around this table today are very fortunate because we are part of a very small drop in the bucket in the overall space. So again, I think that this is why we're trying to do what we're trying to do is first, you need role models. You need women to see other women doing it. You need the young girls to see that other women can do it to be able to be successful. So we're hoping that today we are able to convince you at the ACP that this is a worthwhile initiative and that you will see it and find it in your hearts to give us a minimum of 5 million and a maximum, the gap is 20. So I will stop there. Thank you very much for your attention.